About a year ago, I came to this realization that took about 2 years to get to. I went from loving the iPad after the new redesign that came out in 2018 to hating the iPad because of iPadOS to coming full circle last year and accepting the iPad for what it is. I've been on a journey, and to better understand why and how I got to this point, I first need to explain how computing was applicable to me throughout my life. I will showcase this naturally by using an iPad. The first era was the pre 2008 era, which was 100% PC. And specifically, my dad had a Windows computer, so I was using Windows. I didn't get my first iPhone until the iPhone 3G had came out, and I bought it early 2009. But before that, everything computing wise was done on the PC. Simple. Moving on from there, the next era, which I call the 2009 to 2015 era, that was a 50-50 split of PC and smartphone. So in this case, now throughout this time, I had moved over to getting a MacBook Pro, and I also had an iPhone. I was using an iPhone. Throughout this era, for these 6 years, I was down the middle where I was using the MacBook for all things Final Cut still, as well as I was dabbling with other video editing back when I did YouTube videos in like 2010 or 11, and that was done on a Windows computer. And I also used the computer for a lot of like the Facebook, social media stuff, and definitely YouTube. I used it for YouTube. The smartphone was done for texting, FaceTime, all the stuff that you would kind of use your phone anyway for communication. And then it started as the years were going on in that era, converting more and more to the social media platforms, because apps like Instagram was really only on iPhone, and I was finding myself using more Instagram than Facebook at the time. But overall, broadly, it was a 50-50 split. The next era, the one I actually find the most interesting, is the 2016 to 2022. So another 6 years. Fast forward to here, I get my first iPad in 2016, the 9.7-inch iPad Pro with Apple Pencil support. And I used that device collectively in my ecosystem of stuff. I used that about 10% of the time. It was really a hobby device. It was me just kind of doodling. I knew I wanted an iPad. I didn't know why or how I was going to implement it until I was really introduced to like LumaFusion for editing. But it's just I wanted a bigger screen real estate. During this time, iPhone 6s and 6 Pluses were a thing, and I had an iPhone 6. I never liked having the bigger phone, but the iPad, now that was comfortable to have. So big screen real estate. But at this point, what really encapsulated my usage for my tech was my iPhone. 65% of the time, more than half of it, I was always on my phone for something. Social media in full effect, YouTube in full effect, still communicating with my friends through FaceTime or iMessage, all those things. It was amplified during this era. My PC usage at this point, I had an iMac, got down to about 25%. I was using it strictly for Logic and for Final Cut. And then I was trying to force the iPad in there somehow, some way, especially after 2018. I was like, I want this to work, but admittedly, about only 10% of the time. This is also when I went from really loving it to really hating the iPad. Now where we are at today, I call this the 2023 to now era. So this came after my realization a year ago. And the biggest change that you see is that there are slight adjustments in all ways except the iPad. The iPad, I now use double amount of time, 20% of the time. And that took away from a little bit of my Mac and my iPhone. Still, admittedly, right now, the most used device that I use is my iPhone. 60%, more than half still. But I use my Mac less because I literally only use it for this and my music. That's it. If I'm not creating video content for YouTube or podcasts or whatever, then I am making music. And if I'm not doing that, I'm not on the Mac. I am now using mostly my iPhone or this thing. I found how this fits in my life now, from using it as a baby monitor because I got a camera in my kid's room to I use this almost all the time for YouTube. And I'm doodling and dabbling more with Apple Pencil stuff in the creative side of things. But I got one more for you, and I call this one, this next era, in the future. Now, what does that mean? This is where I want it to go. And what the first thing you notice is the iPad increased again, doubling again to 40% usage. That's where I'm trying to get to, at the cost of using my iPhone less. I want to use it less than half of the time. The Mac stays at 20% because I can't really go any lower. 10% of my time is allocated to doing this, and another 10% of my time is allocated making music. That's just not going to change. But instead of using my iPhone for literally everything because it's so convenient right there, I like using the iPad. I like having the bigger screen real estate without it having to be in my pocket. And I've always loved the hardware that had to embody this device. It was the software I was struggling with. With that history out of the way, I can now say this with context. I am a minimalist, especially when it comes to my tech. I only use a few things, but I use them very well. I am not a jack of all trades. I'm a master of three. And I don't mean that in the sense of iPhone, iPad, and Mac. I mean, there are three things that I have in my skill set that I am very, very good at doing. Minimalism has served me well throughout my life. From the more brandless t-shirts that I wear to the somewhat naked aesthetic of my setup right now, at least. It also helped me get out of debt, for example, and it helped me with extreme focus to get to the lifestyle that I have today. And I always try to implement minimalism in everything that I do because it's a lifestyle, not a goal. For example, I have a more minimalistic home screen, and I try to keep my apps to a minimum as well. I pay for the 200 gigs of iCloud storage because that's all I need. And when it comes to hardware, I try to implement this lifestyle in that too. From using the iPhone only as my continuity cam for the longest time instead of this camera, or downsizing all my computers to one super computer. But that's the thing, right there. Fundamentally, I can't. And I've been battling with Apple to make it fit my needs over the iPad's function. I want it all. A professional studio for audio and video production on a computer with 5G capabilities, as well as a tablet focused on touch interface first and an entertainment consumption device. After WWDC, I saw a podcast where Craig was talking about how he doesn't want the iPad to become a Mac. It's not supposed to replace it. The Mac was meant to be a Mac. It's meant to be the beast of all things that I want from this studio. The iPad, in contrast, is meant to be for everything else. And could I just use the Mac for all those everything else's? Sure. But then again, no. I've been using the Apple Pencil for literal work as well as hobby features, on top of signing a lot of legal documents recently. As a minimalist who doesn't keep much physical documentations around anymore, I need an Apple Pencil. I need an iPad. And admittedly, alongside all the practical reasons for using an iPad, on a more emotional level, it's just more fun to use. It builds intimacy the same way an iPhone does. When you are more hands-on with your tech, subconsciously, you build more trust with it. Apple knew this all the way back when Steve Jobs had launched the first iMac with a handle on it. It was to build trust. And that's not to say I don't trust my MacBook, but I know that device so well, inside and out, that I don't need to use it for more than its core functions. My Mac is my server, so to say. It's my rock. It's my foundation. It's my most important device, but it's also my biggest tool. And I keep it docked most of the time these days. But my iPad, I take it with me everywhere throughout the house. And I do use it more than my Mac now. So with all that said, let me explain why the iPad is the way it is and not like a Mac. The Mac was built and made for all these amazing applications that we use, like Final Cut and Logic, for me, as well as the best file management system, unlike the iPad right now. It was built around using all these different windows and even simultaneously. But the iPad, it was built around the strongest app ecosystem in the world. No other app ecosystem competes with the intuitiveness of iOS. The iPad was built intentionally around iOS. Steve Jobs even says it outright in its premiere keynote event, because the iPhone, iOS, and the App Store is undoubtedly not only the strongest element for Apple's bottom line, but also in the modern technical world overall. And the iPad has a better chance at surviving and growing on that platform than the marginal sector of computing that the Mac has against Windows. The iPad and all post-iPhone devices from Apple Watch to Vision Pro are only relevant in today's world because it was all built and designed off of the back of the legendary iPhone and its everlasting ecosystem. If the iPhone is what defines Apple today, then any new product after 2010 is obviously going to borrow from the success of iPhone. And I get that now. At least now, I finally understand iPadOS.